What if the Vietnam War didn't actually begin in the jungles, but in quiet rooms in Washington, years earlier, before the first combat troops landed, before the nightly news showed burning villages, before protests filled American streets? Decisions were already being made, carefully, quietly, strategically. Most Americans believed the war escalated suddenly, a response, a reaction, something forced by events overseas. But behind closed doors, long before the headlines, conversations were unfolding that would shape the course of history. Memos were written, commitments were hinted at, lines were crossed slowly, almost invisibly. This wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a series of small choices, each one reasonable on its own, each one easier than the alternative, until turning back no longer felt possible. Tonight, we're going beyond the battlefield. We're stepping inside the strategy rooms, the political calculations, the fears that shape policy. Because to understand how America entered Vietnam, we have to look at the secret decisions made before the war ever officially began. If you want to understand the moments behind the moments, the hidden steps that shaped American history, stay with me and make sure you're subscribed, because this story changes the way you see everything that followed. In the years before Vietnam became a household word, fear was already shaping American policy. Not fear of a single country, not fear of one army crossing a border, but something larger, something harder to see. The fear that if one nation fell to communism, others would follow. Quietly, inevitably, like a line of standing dominoes. In Washington, Vietnam was rarely discussed as just a distant Southeast Asian nation. It was seen as a test, a signal, a message to allies and adversaries watching from every corner of the world. After World War II, the United States had stepped into a new role, a global leader, a defender of a fragile balance, and that balance felt constantly under threat. China had turned communist. Eastern Europe was behind the Iron Curtain. The Korean War had already proven that limited conflicts could explode into major confrontations. To policymakers, the map of the world didn't look stable. It looked vulnerable. So when Vietnam appeared on intelligence briefings, it wasn't viewed in isolation. It was connected to Thailand, to Laos, to Cambodia, to the credibility of the United States itself. Officials asked a simple but heavy question. If America failed to act here, where would it fail next? No president wanted to be remembered as the one who lost another country. The language inside those meetings was careful, strategic, often clinical. They spoke of containment, of balance of power, of commitments and alliances. But underneath those formal terms was something more personal. The fear of appearing weak, the fear of encouraging aggression elsewhere, the fear that hesitation would invite something larger, and fear as a way of narrowing options. Publicly, Vietnam was still distant to most Americans. Few could point to it on a map. Few understood its internal politics or its history of colonial struggle. But inside policy circles, it had already become symbolic, a line that could not be allowed to break. The domino theory offered a simple framework, easy to explain, easy to defend. If one country fell, others would follow. Therefore, stopping the first fall became essential. The theory didn't require certainty. It required precaution, and precaution often favors action over restraint. Each intelligence report that hinted at instability reinforced the same conclusion. Each internal debate circled back to credibility. Allies in Europe were watching. Rivals were watching. The world was watching. Or at least, that's how it felt. In that atmosphere, restraint began to look risky. Patience began to look like weakness. And limited involvement began to look like responsibility. The decisions made during this period were not dramatic declarations of war. They were policy shifts, budget approvals, advisory roles, quiet reassurances to foreign leaders, steps designed to prevent a larger crisis, steps taken in the name of stability. But every step forward created a new baseline. Every commitment, even a small one, raised the cost of stepping back. Because once credibility is invoked, it becomes something leaders feel they must protect, at almost any price. By the early 1960s, the question inside Washington was no longer whether Vietnam mattered. It was how much America was willing to invest to prevent its collapse. The logic had taken hold. If the United States stood firm, the spread could be contained. If it hesitated, the consequences might ripple far beyond Southeast Asia. Fear had not declared war. It had not sent divisions across the Pacific, but it had shaped a framework through which every new development would be judged. And once policy is shaped by fear, every event begins to confirm it. Vietnam was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of resolve, a measure of strength, a test of whether the United States would defend the line it had drawn in a divided world. And that belief, more than any single battle, set the stage for everything that followed. Officially, the United States was not at war. There were no massive troop deployments, no formal declaration, no primetime address announcing a full-scale conflict. On paper, America's role in Vietnam was limited, advisory, supportive, temporary, but reality was already shifting. The first American military advisors arrived with the specific purpose: to train, to assist, to strengthen South Vietnam's ability to defend itself. It sounded controlled, measured, responsible, the kind of involvement that could prevent a larger crisis without becoming one. At first, the numbers were small, a few hundred, then a few thousand, each increase justified by conditions on the ground, each request framed as necessary to stabilize a fragile ally. The language mattered. They were advisors, not combat troops. They were providing support, not fighting a war. These distinctions created space, political space, public space, space to move carefully without alarming the American people. But advisory roles in unstable regions rarely remained simple. As the conflict inside Vietnam intensified, advisors found themselves closer to the front lines. Training missions required observation. Observation required proximity. Proximity blurred lines. When the forces you train come under fire, the separation between advising and participating becomes thin. Reports from the field grew more urgent. South Vietnamese forces struggled with morale. Leadership was inconsistent. Rural areas were increasingly contested. Each update carried the same underlying message: more support was needed. And so the mission expanded. Additional funding was approved. Equipment shipments increased. Helicopters arrived. Intelligence operations deepened. What began as guidance evolved into coordination. What began as assistance evolved into operational involvement. Still, there was no single dramatic shift. No moment when America publicly crossed from peace into war. Instead, there was momentum. Every new commitment created a responsibility to protect the previous one. If advisors were present, they needed protection. If equipment was supplied, it needed to be used effectively. If credibility had been promised, it had to be maintained. In Washington, these were incremental adjustments, logical responses to changing circumstances. But on the ground, the American footprint was becoming more visible, more embedded, more essential to the survival of South Vietnam's government. The American public, meanwhile, heard little about this gradual deepening. Vietnam remained distant, abstract, a situation being managed, a problem being handled. The absence of a formal declaration created a psychological buffer. Without an official war, there was no sense of national mobilization, no dramatic shift in daily life. The country moved forward, largely unaware that its involvement was quietly solidifying. By the early 1960s, thousands of American personnel were already operating in Vietnam, flying missions, coordinating strategy, supporting combat operations. Officially, they were still advisors. Unofficially, the line separating advisory work from direct participation had grown increasingly fragile. And with each passing month, withdrawal became more complicated. Pulling back no longer meant ending a minor program. It meant risking the collapse of an ally whose stability now depended on American presence. It meant signaling uncertainty to the world. It meant admitting that early assessments might have been overly optimistic. So the path forward, even if uneasy, felt safer than reversal. The advisors had arrived quietly, without ceremony, without dramatic headlines. But their presence marked something significant, a foothold, a commitment in motion. America had not declared war, but it had begun to invest in an outcome. And once a nation begins investing in the survival of another government, with money, equipment, and people, the distance between assistance and ownership starts to disappear. The soldiers had not yet arrived in massive numbers, but the foundation for their arrival was already being built. War is never decided only on distant soil. It is also shaped in campaign seasons, in press conferences, in private political calculations that rarely make it into history books. As America's involvement in Vietnam deepened quietly overseas, pressure was building at home. Presidents were not just managing foreign policy. They were managing perception, reputation, strength. No leader wanted to be seen as soft on communism. That phrase alone carried weight in mid-century America. Elections had already been influenced by accusations of weakness. Political opponents watched closely for any sign of retreat. Any hesitation could be framed as failure. Vietnam became more than a foreign policy challenge. It became a measure of resolve. Each administration inherited the commitments of the previous one. To reverse course would not simply mean changing strategy. It could be portrayed as undoing American credibility. And credibility, once questioned, was difficult to restore. Inside the White House and across Capitol Hill, advisors weighed not only military assessments, but political consequences. What would allies think if the United States stepped back? What would rivals conclude? And perhaps just as importantly, what would voters believe? Presidents operate within narrow margins. Approval ratings, congressional support, media narratives. A decision made overseas could reshape domestic stability overnight. In public, speeches emphasized responsibility, support for freedom, the importance of standing by allies. These themes resonated with an American audience that had lived through World War II and the early Cold War. Strength was not just admired, it was expected. But behind the speeches were calculations. Would reducing involvement invite criticism that America had lost another country? Would escalation prevent that accusation, or deepen it later? Could a limited approach satisfy both strategic needs and political realities? There were no easy answers, only risks. Political advisors often warned of appearing indecisive. Elections were never far away. A foreign policy setback could dominate headlines for months. In that climate, caution sometimes looked like vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous. At the same time, the American public had not yet demanded large-scale intervention. Vietnam was not dominating kitchen table conversations. It was a developing situation, not a defining crisis. That created a narrow window, the ability to act without intense scrutiny. Incremental escalation fit that window. Small increases in support did not require sweeping public debate. Limited actions could be framed as necessary adjustments. The absence of a formal declaration kept the situation flexible, manageable. But flexibility can also conceal commitment. Each political decision reinforced the previous one. To question the mission meant questioning earlier judgments. To slow involvement meant explaining why earlier assurances of progress had been optimistic. No administration wanted to inherit a fragile situation and then be blamed for its collapse. So the path of least immediate resistance often led forward. The political cost of withdrawal seemed immediate and visible. The long-term cost of escalation was uncertain and distant. And in politics, immediate consequences usually weigh more heavily than distant possibilities. Vietnam was becoming intertwined with leadership itself. To hold the line, there was to demonstrate strength everywhere. Or at least, that was the belief shaping the room. Presidents faced briefings filled with maps and projections, but they also faced opinion polls and upcoming elections. The war, still undeclared, was already influencing domestic calculations. By the time public attention intensified, many foundational choices had already been made under quieter conditions. Not in moments of national panic, but in measured discussions about image, credibility, and political survival. The battlefield was thousands of miles away, but the political stakes were right at home. And together, they pushed the nation one step closer to a commitment that would soon be impossible to ignore. There's a moment in every long decision-making process when options begin to disappear. Not because they were formally removed, not because someone announced a final choice, but because the weight of everything that came before makes turning back feel heavier than moving forward. By the time Vietnam reached the center of national attention, years of quiet commitments had already shaped the path. Advisors were on the ground. Equipment had been delivered. Public statements had drawn lines about credibility and resolve. The United States was no longer observing events from a distance. It was connected to the outcome. Then came incidents that demanded response. Events that could be presented clearly to the American people. Moments that simplified a complicated situation into something direct and urgent. The narrative shifted from gradual involvement to necessary action. In Washington, the question was no longer whether America had interests in Vietnam. That had already been established. The question was how forcefully those interests would be defended. And when a nation has invested years of policy, funding, and reputation into a single outcome, restraint begins to look like surrender. The phrase "point of no return" is rarely spoken in real time. Leaders do not gather and declare that they have crossed it. Instead, they justify the next step as temporary, proportional, measured, just enough to stabilize the situation. But stabilization often requires reinforcement. Reinforcement requires presence. Presence requires protection. And protection requires more presence. The cycle tightens. When broader military authorization finally arrived, it did not emerge from a vacuum. It rested on the foundation built quietly over the previous decade. To the public, it felt sudden, a decisive response to unfolding events. But inside policy circles, it felt like continuation. The logic was consistent with earlier fears. If America stepped back now, after years of commitment, what message would that send? To allies depending on reassurance, to adversaries testing limits, to citizens who had been told that resolve mattered. Each argument for escalation leaned on past promises. Each promise reduced flexibility. By the time large numbers of American combat troops deployed, the debate was no longer about initial involvement. It was about preserving credibility, protecting personnel already engaged, and preventing visible defeat. Withdrawal no longer meant stepping away from a distant conflict. It meant unraveling years of decisions made in good faith, under pressure, in the shadow of global rivalry. And so the threshold was crossed, not in a single dramatic leap, but in accumulated steps that narrowed alternatives until forward motion felt inevitable. Vietnam did not begin with a roar. It began with quiet agreements, strategic memos, advisory roles, political calculations. And when the moment came that demanded a public answer, the groundwork ensured that only one response seemed viable. By the time most Americans realized the depth of involvement, the architecture of war had already been assembled. The point of no return rarely announces itself. It simply arrives. And once it does, history moves quickly. If this story challenges the way you've understood the beginning of Vietnam, there is more beneath the surface. Because the public timeline is often only part of the truth. In the next episode, we'll examine the pivotal event that transformed limited involvement into full-scale war, and why its interpretation still shapes debate today. If you value deeper analysis that goes beyond the headlines and into the decisions made behind closed doors, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this story that changed America forever.